this is meant to be both a balm and a call to arms, figuratively speaking. Hopefully, no arms will be raised, but um, a call to action to not let this moment slip by, and then another decade, score of years, or century go by before we actually rectify this great sin in our country.
So I'd like to introduce now our speaker, Matthew Evan Taylor. So I'd like to share just a little bit about him before I turn it over to him. Matthew is a composer and saxophonist, and he has been hailed as a promising new voice and a risk taker whose music is insistent and defiant and envelopingly hypnotic by many different media outlets. Matthew is a Southern kid who worshiped at the altar of Cannonball Adderley, Ornette Coleman, and Charles Mingus. Matthew's music has been performed across the United States and Europe by such ensembles as the Cleveland Orchestra, the Detroit Symphony, the Metropolitan Ensemble, Amani Winds, and the Vermont Symphony Orchestra. As a performer, Matthew has worked with musicians Elliott Sharp, Marilyn Crispell, Tatsusa Nakatani, Taylor Ho Bynum, Mary Halverson, and various artists, but with Molly Zuckerman, Hartung, Danielle Tegetter, and dancers Catherine Kramer, Sarah Shelton, Laurel Jenkins, and Lida Winfield. His most recent project, New Century, New Voices, is a concert series in Middlebury, Vermont, celebrating the continued contributions of women and composers of color to the classical music canon. The inaugural season, which began in January 2019, included collaborations with composers Carlos Simon, Marco Spalter, and Gabriela Lena Frank, and the Vermont-based new music ensemble Turn Music. Matthew is also an assistant professor of music at Middlebury College here in Vermont. And so I would like to turn it over to Matthew. Thank you, Matthew, so much for being here with us.
Thank you all for having me. It's really a pleasure to speak with the Vermont Humanities Council again as part of First Wednesdays, and this year as the fall for the fall conference. So today I would like to talk about, and I'm going to talk about my album Say Their Names and kind of the background to how I created it. Also, we're going to listen to a few selections from it. And so I just wanted to just go a little further into my background. I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, where among the many stories that I would hear would be recollections of my older family members who grew up or were working in Birmingham during the height of the civil rights movement. Some actually knew people that were on the freedom rides and were friends with people with the young women that died in the church bombing in 1964. And so I was always kind of in awe of the heroism of that age. And like so many people my age at that time in the South, when we were growing up, especially if you're in a city like Birmingham, things seemed a lot better and a lot more equal. And the message of we're all living Martin Luther King's dream was really strong, and meant that like activism wasn't for me and my friends at least, wasn't a paramount issue in our eyes. We had kind of felt like our parents and our grandparents had won the war. Of course, now we were seeing that we were very naive at that time. And so this project, Say Their Names, kind of is my full embracing of activism through art, through voicing my own view in this living in this democracy. Perhaps not in marching, because living here in Vermont, I'm not placed well to be a participant in some of the larger marches or even participate in the conversations in a meaningful way. But still to be able to put out my own contribution that can help raise awareness and raise funds for organizations like Black Lives Matter and the Equal Justice Initiative. So what I'd like to do first is so backing up, Say Their Names is actually an outcropping of this larger project that I started around my birthday called back in December of 2019 called Project 39. And Project 39 was my commitment to improvise every day for at least 39 seconds and then post it on social media, either on my Instagram at Matthew Evan Taylor or on Facebook. That project kind of started morphing and taking on a life of its own, where my improvisations ceased being 39 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes, and started becoming these pretty fleshed out compositions in their own right, lasting anywhere between 5 and 15 minutes. As I was engaging with this new practice, of course, we all were sent home for in order to try to quell the rising tide of the coronavirus. And so now I found myself in this daily practice, but in a context of being isolated from my normal outlets for music. So, working with ensembles, going to visit those ensembles and help them interpret my music, speaking with other composers at universities and colleges, or going somewhere and playing. Like right before we had to go into quarantine, I had been in Miami presenting music and performing with musicians from the University of Miami, and just kind of engaging. It was actually a very, very lovely time. It was a bit of a homecoming. I went to the University of Miami for my grad studies. And so I got to talk with a lot of people that I knew down there, and that actually presented a point of great optimism that was very quickly extinguished once we became fully aware of the impact that COVID would have or could have on the country. So once we went into quarantine, I started working with my process with Project 39 by augmenting kind of the tools I would use. So I'm a saxophonist and wind player, generally speaking, but I decided that I would also incorporate a bit of technology known as a loop station, which is a 3-channel loop station, looping pedal that allows me to play with myself and layer different parts on top of myself as I'm playing. And so I'll give you, you'll get to hear that in a second. And so during my time in COVID, like these pieces were getting so elaborate, I decided, okay, actually, I'm going to turn these into albums and create a new sound world for myself that's a bit outside of myself, a little more personal, a little more reflective of what is affecting me currently. In late May, That's when let's see, I'm going to get that date wrong. May 28th, I believe, is when we saw the video of George Floyd. And I realized that perhaps I found myself very frustrated because I had, of course, been following the story of Ahmaud Arbery, who, from living in the South, was murdered in the name of vigilante justice, basically, which for those of you that may not realize it, that's what lynching is. It's vigilante justice against a community that is marginalized. So I'd been frustrated with that, and I'd created some compositions that referred to it, but then I still felt isolated. But then the protests that unfolded after the George Floyd video came out, I realized that I wasn't isolated here in Vermont, that there was a way for me to connect with the movement. And so I decided that I would respond to the first week of protests. Each day in Project 39, I would create and upload a new reaction to the events of the day. And these 7 days, May 29th through June 5th, became what I called Say Their Names, which I released on Bandcamp in June 6th. So I'm going to play you the first track, which is the first track that I created, but it's not the first track on the album. And it was a simple question, and it was basically the thesis question of this album. And it was, why can't we breathe? Why is this still happening? So let's take a listen to that, and I can explain a little more of what's going on. So this typifies my process of creating these pieces. I have I'll improvise a line, and then record it into my loop station, and then each improvisation from there responds to other loops, and then I fade in the loops. I try to part of this is game playing for myself. Like I try to make seamless transitions into new sound textures using this loop station, without the audience maybe seeing the seams of it. Um, but so I wanted to continue the narrative of of the creation of this album. Um, I finally heard about the Breonna Taylor uh, tragedy around May 30th, May 31st. And so I decided that I would do a more kind of composerly or Western canon type of piece where I use this contrapuntal form known as canon, where if you think about row, row, row your boat, it's a round, and um, I wanted to create a piece that invoked kind of that circular idea of a canon or a round, but also had a little bit of an evocation of the church and of a prayer service. So for this one, I'm going to show you a video. This is the opening track recorded in May 31st, called Lamentations for the Fallen. from a personal standpoint, that piece is was me processing in real time the pain that the generational pain that was being felt everywhere. And it's interesting looking back on this process and trying to explain what went into making this album. This album and a group of albums I'm putting out actually currently represent me embracing things that I had denied in my own musical output because of my kind of focus on writing for Western European style ensembles, so orchestra, string quartets, things like that. And so what you were witnessing in that video was kind of a breaking down of a wall that I had put in place that is kind of trained into musicians and artists from an early age, this kind of idea of separating yourself, like kind of the artist is at a remove from some of society's ills. There are things that you can just create music for music's sake, which for a while was something that was actually denied to Black artists that wanted to create in the classical music realm. And so I was kind of stubbornly trying to hold on to that. But then I realized in the making of this album and the greater Project 39 project, that I'd been wrong about that I needed to connect on a visceral level with what was going on, what was ambient in the air, and that my trying to be removed from that kind of thing was being complicit in the persistence of a system that continues to oppress people that look like me, that continues to oppress people that happen to be Asian, that happen to be Latinx, happen to be indigenous. And this was the first step towards understanding how, I mean, I still wouldn't call myself an activist, but the music that I created for this, I'd hoped would bring to focus some aspect of what the activism around racial justice means to people like me, and what it could mean for this country. On this album, there are other tracks. Let's see, how many in total? 7 in total for a week. A little less than an hour of music. And I have pieces on here that are sarcastic, that are reverential. You heard pensive and rage, and all encapsulated in Lamentations of the Fallen. And so the connection between all of these is that this is meant to be both a balm and a call to arms, figuratively speaking. Hopefully no arms will be raised, but a call to action to not let this moment slip by, and then another decade score of years or century go by before we actually rectify this great sin in our country. So my hope is that from this presentation, you'll take a listen to it. It's available on Bandcamp. It's not, I don't profit from the album. I actually donate all funds that come in. And so please support. If you happen to, if you happen to know of some other racial justice organization that needs help financially, there's a way for you to message me through Bandcamp to explain, to be on the lookout for that. Yeah, so I guess the closer is that I was looking for a way to be able to respond in the moment through music, which is a very hard thing to do. If you think of the process of creating a piece of music, especially in the way that a lot of us are trained, it's really hard to have something that's ready to go, even within a week. And luckily, I'd fallen into this practice that allowed me to do this and to be honest and reflect, to be kind of a mirror to what was going on in the world. So yeah, I'm hopeful that this music will have an impact. Over the summer, I raised over $2,000 with this. So, and I'm hoping that this can be a model for future albums where I can raise funds for organizations that I care about. So yeah, I think that's it. If there are any questions, I see one already in the chat. So yeah, thank you.
She says that you heard a lot in the first piece and that it was actually very hard to listen to, but it mirrored what it sounded and felt like by the time George Floyd's murder was widely reported. And she talks about the first notes being alarm sounds at the pace of a normal breath, questioning voices, warning, protesting voices, and all of that in one section. And so she says, of course, that might not have been what she did exactly, but that's where she's coming from, personal and universal feelings. And so he is talking about how her own identity here and how that plays into it, and how this really reflects a lamentation on your part and socioculturally for all of us. So I also noticed that, and I'm sure others did, the contrast of what those two pieces felt like. Would you like to speak to any of that, Matthew? What that process was like, or how that feels for you looking back?
Well, so I don't go into these pieces looking for particular sounds, and often I try not to name pieces because I don't want to overly influence people's interpretations of the piece. But these were meant to be what I said they were, and so the thing about improvising is that I'm accessing sounds, and I may not realize where the sound originally comes from. So it's very possible that you're hearing sounds that were influenced by sirens and things like that, but that's not necessarily what I'm doing. I try to trust the listener to find whatever it is they're hearing and put word to it for themselves. There's not, outside of the context, within the context of Say Their Names, there's a wide breadth of interpretations for each of these pieces. I think that that would agree with the title of the piece and my intent behind the piece. So I'm always grateful for people telling me what they heard and how it touched them or angered them or whatever. I'm always open to that.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor, for this presentation. You know, at first I was hit by the music and sounds, trying to relate as a former alto saxophonist myself. When I was in middle school, I was in the marching band, and I, you know, sort of connected that way at first, but I had to close my eyes to really, I think, begin to develop a personal interpretation of the sounds. And, you know, forgive me if I use the term sounds, but I noticed that in the first piece, in the background, there was this constant sound. Is it fair to say that that background piece, that background sound, represents the system of white domination and its consequences that just doesn't change, that just continues to, you know, exist in the background there, and it just doesn't change. In light of Breonna Taylor and Mr. Floyd.
Yeah, I didn't have a specific identification for anything in that piece, and why can't we breathe? I think that piece literally started with me asking myself, why can't we breathe? That was the question I asked myself as I was sitting down to create it. And so there's that exasperation, that kind of existentialist absurdism that you're hearing in it is kind of native to that question. You know, we're promised life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? And you know, you can't have life without breathing, but so many of us are just a hair's breadth away from being denied that breath. And it's a bit like banging your head against the wall, trying to get people to understand that that the fact that I'm under threat is actually a threat to everyone. Right. What's so frustrating to hear from people that say all lives matter is that, why is that the retort? Why are you dismissing us that way? Your life matters more if my life matters. If my life matters to the police, then all the times that white people have been killed by the police, that will reduce too, because of the improvements that have to be put in place to protect me. And for some reason, the way we talk about it just is always lacking in that way. It's always, and it benefits people that are in power. It's always segmented demographically. The issue is not Black lives versus all lives. Because Black lives matters, all lives matters, right? So like and that's like it seems like I can't see, maybe, I think if to all of you who are my white friends, any of you that are listening that are white, that's the thing that seems to be missing every time there's a criticism hurled at us for protesting, at Black Lives Matter for being uttered. It's that you're ignoring the fact that we're not asking for anything extraordinary, right? Like this is not an extraordinary it's extraordinary that it's taken this long. Just like Barack Obama is not the most extraordinary black man. He's a black man that happened to finally come along at a time where the country was ready to elect a black man. Kamala Harris is only special because the country realizes that she's qualified, but she's not the first qualified black woman, right? So these are all those things that can be represented by that sound you're talking about, Christopher. It's just these constant things where for a black person, for a black person, for a Latinx person, for any BIPOC person, we are constantly being reminded that we're not in the mainstream, but then we're being ridiculed for not achieving in the mainstream. And so, so all of that's playing in my mind when I make that piece.
And just to respond to you, I thank you for your response. And as a Latino American myself in Vermont, I represent the invasion community that's taking over America and will denigrate the Anglo-Saxon culture. And so here again, the sense of being a foreigner in your own country, 16 generations of Hispanics in the United States, and yet this is the form of psychological warfare that we experience.
Yeah.
So
that
is where I can share empathy, attempt to share empathy with what you're attempting to convey here. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. The other aspect of that too is the idea of systemic racism. It still seems like people think that only black people complain about it, but the systemic nature of it is that there is this hierarchy of races in this country. That's the system. That's part of the system. So the fact that a lighter skinned Latinx person like yourself could be afforded a little more leeway, but as soon as people see your last name, that checks you a little bit. My partner's Asian, so she's had some advantages, quote unquote, but she's had to live under the burden of the ideal minority myth. And it's done great damage within her community because we are being told that there is a winner amongst us, and everyone should kind of try to position themselves in a way so that they're not like black people, so that they're not like a group of people that had no rights, then won rights, then had those rights taken away, and then had to win them back, and their rights are slowly being eroded again. So and that's something that actually it's part of the reason why I'm less stressed out here in the state of Vermont because you're not constantly aware of it, and it's allowed, I think, the marginalized communities here in the state to be a lot more cooperative with each other. So we don't have that kind of pecking order nonsense going on. But it's also a shame in Vermont because the majority of Vermonters do not realize how they still benefit from that system because it's not, they don't think it's an issue. There's not, you can go days without seeing a black person if you wanted to in this state. No person of color in the state of Vermont can go a day without seeing white people unless they just lock themselves up in their house and don't turn on the TV. So, yeah. And so it's like, I guess that's behind this album too, is just I'm trying to break through, you know. Uh, if you think about the construction of the instruments that I use in this album, I mentioned in that first track, Why Can't We Breathe, that instrument that I'm using to breathe is the hula su, which is a Chinese instrument. The saxophone is an instrument that was created in Belgium in the late 19th century. The flute is an instrument that is basically not tied to any particular culture. I just happen to be playing a European transverse flute, right? So like, these are instruments that people, other than the hula su, these are instruments that people are used to hearing, and I'm trying to use them to burst through and see if I can't get people to engage with the unknown for themselves.
Right. I just wanted to appear and say I'm a real person. I just had my morning face, so I was trying to stay quiet. You woke me up.
Thank you for your comments.
I was already a little woke, but you know.
Thank you, Deb. Thank you for that so much. And thank you to everyone for what you added in the chat and for taking this time to be with us. And especially thank you so much, Matthew, for taking this time and sharing your art, sharing your stories with us. All of us here, I think, got a lot out of it. And to your point, I think everyone is taking away something very rich and very different and unique to everyone. So thank you